Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the club. Welcome to the inaugural session of Vasant Vihar Club's Spring Fest 2022. Much as we would have loved to have you all in the club and join us for this wonderful Spring Fest, which is typical of Vasant Vihar Club. Unfortunately, continued COVID restrictions preclude us from doing that. Nevertheless, we are using technology as we have all of us done over the last 2 years, and we are bringing this to you over Zoom. This evening, we have a very interesting session given the current circumstances around the world. We have a very renowned and knowledgeable panel. May I just take a couple of minutes to introduce? We have Professor Raja Mohan. He is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies, and he was formerly the director of that institute. He was also professor of South Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University and at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. We also have with us Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, who was from 2016 to 2020 chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, which advises India's National Security Council. He was joint secretary in the PMO, during which foreign affairs or dealing with foreign affairs, nuclear energy, space, defense, and national security. We have Dr. Sanjay Baru, a distinguished fellow of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies. He was media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and director for geoeconomics and strategy, International Institute of Strategic Studies at London. And moderating today's session is resident of Vasant Vihar, well known to all of us, and a member of the club, Mr. Jaidev Ranade. He's also known as our China expert. He has been president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy, retired as additional secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, Government of India in August 2008, and is a former member of the National Security Advisory Board. Distinguished Fellow of the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies. Before I hand over the in a manner of speaking, the mic to Mr. Ranade, I would invite our President, General Shankar Prasad, to welcome the speakers today. General Shankar Prasad.
Thank you, Raj. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of Vasant Vihar who are joining in, those from outside. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming today a very, very well-known panelist. We're lucky to have them today in these difficult times. The Vasant Vihar started a Lit Fest since 2016, and we had some very successful physical Lit Fest in 16, 17, and 18, and 19 actually. But thereafter, when pandemic struck us, we were forced to do a Zoom Lit Fest, which lasted about 3 days in continuation the whole day, and it was the grandest success that I can ever think of. As many thousand people attended it across the globe. And that gave us some encouragement to do a similar thing. This year, again, we were very keen to do a physical Lit Fest. And in early January, it looked, or maybe end of December, it looked that we may be able to do a Lit Fest physically. But suddenly in the month of January, it again deteriorated and we had to go back to some kind of a lockdown. So we then decided to do a Spring Fest in a virtual mode. And by the time we had finalized this, and just about a couple of days ago, we found that the restrictions had been removed, and we felt very sorry that we were still going to do this on virtual and not in physical. Notwithstanding that, I think the committee of ours has been able to rig up reasonably good programs, which should be of quite a great lot of interest to us. The first item that struck us was to talk about international relations. So that's something that really absorbs us. And we decided to do a program on international relations and uneasy environments. Now, this subject we had decided well before the conflict in Ukraine started. And it just so happened that the Ukraine conflict has overtaken just everything else. So this subject becomes all the more relevant in our today's work. And you find since the first light till last light and beyond the last light till first light, every media channel, every television channel blaring out on what's happening in Ukraine. And everybody seems to be glued up to it, wanting to find out what exactly is going on. For that purpose, I think we have been very lucky to get Professor Rajamohan. Professor Rajamohan is one of the finest strategic analysts that we have in our country. He writes frequently in the newspapers. All of us read that piece of his very interesting and with great interest and carefully, and pick up points from there. Raja, thanks a lot for coming today. We are very grateful to you for finding time for us. And we are definitely looking forward to some great insight into the current happenings, not only in Ukraine and Russia, but the rest of the world as well. Ambassador Raghavan has a fantastic career behind him. And Ambassador, I really welcome you. Thanks a lot for coming on our program today. You've done everything possible, which is related to diplomacy, which is related to security. And I think we couldn't have found a better person to be on this program to give us a real insight of how diplomacy works and how security gets what they probably say is security and diplomacy, or rather, yes, security and diplomacy are the two sides of the same coin. And you seem to be having experience of both the sides of the coin, having been in the positions that you've held in our country. So thank you very much, Ambassador Raghavan, for being here with us. We have Sanjay, Dr. Sanjay Baru. Again, it so happens that he is one of those very few people in this available to us in this country who has great insight knowledge of the administration, the way the government runs, the way the Prime Minister's office runs, the way security is handled, and most importantly, where the media is, or the media has handled. Today, if you ask me, and I think Professor Baru will give us more detail than that, media is like a major weapon in deciding the futures of our economy, futures of our security, futures of our diplomacy. And today, I think it's so visible when we talk about Ukraine and Russia, and just everything is based, our comments are based on media inputs. Somebody says it's a Western motivated media. Somebody says Russian media is quiet, or whatever else. So Dr. Baru, thank you so much for being with our panel today. We really look forward to hearing from you exactly how the media plays as a very major weapon in the management of international relations today, and of course, as well as domestic relations. And finally, of course, my very dear friend, Ranade. He is again a very experienced person in both security as well as diplomacy. And the third great asset that we have in him is knowledge about international relations and foreign intelligence. So he's worked all his life on this. He's written books on China. He writes on newspapers frequently. And I think he is one of the finest people we could have had today as a moderator or as somebody who can be in conversation with three very distinguished panels. So thank you so much, Raj, and thank you so much, all our panelists, to be here. And thank you, Jayan, for being with us today. I'll hand over to you, and you can begin the proceedings now. Over to you, Jayan.
Thank you, General Shankar Prasad. Thank you, Mr. Raj Sharma. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me just fill in a bit or add a bit to what General Shankar Prasad said about the title. In addition to organizing a very good Lit Fest, it seems that we are also clairvoyant, because we did think of anticipate, shall I say, what international relations is all about until Putin beat us to the punch, and he has really upset whatever established order that there was. His actions have actually shaken the foundations of the international world order. And what is now happening, what we see is almost a contest for establishing a new world order, which will take place. But before I get into this, let me just say that we have panelists here who will offer different perspectives on world affairs and what is happening. I'll begin by saying a little bit about what's going on from the Chinese perspective as I see it,
Yeah,
followed by Ambassador Raghavan, who with
concentrate on
experience of Russia and international affairs can go into the next. And Dr. Rajamohan can segue into that, followed by Mr. Sanjay Baru. Since time is short, we will each speak for about 7 to 8 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a second round of a few minutes each before we open up for question and answers. So let me just get into the situation as I see it, and I will just touch on the main points. As I said, what we are seeing today is actually the world order, international world order being challenged, the United States and the West being put on notice by Putin, who feels that he has not had a fair enough voice so far. And he, along with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, also called the chairman of everything, they are asking for the democratization.
It's 1 hour now. We have to just keep.
They are asking for the democratization of the world order. Now, it is significant here that Putin decided to go and visit Beijing, the excuse being the Beijing Winter Olympics, but actually to meet Xi Jinping, have a summer. And
Something.
worth noting that Xi Jinping and Putin are both, if I may say, creatures or apparatchiks of their respective communist parties. So to a large extent, there is a kind of an ideological affinity that they share. The second factor is Putin knowing fully well what he's going to do and what he's going to trigger, when to meet the Chinese leader, a country which has a GDP 10 times that of Russia, and yet where the trade with Russia accounts for barely 1%. So it's an important player as far as Putin is concerned. On the 4th of February, when they met, my assessment, which I feel is borne out by adequate detail, is that Putin gave Xi Jinping a fair insight, if not a detailed briefing, into what he was planning to do. And there are certain indicators of that. Apart from the joint statement, where they both spoke of the color revolution, which is their fear, as far as Putin is concerned, he looked at Georgia, he looked at the Crimea, he looked now at Ukraine as places where the West was trying to engineer regime change through color revolution. For Xi Jinping, it's a massive fear, a paranoia almost. For the last 1.5 years, he's been worried about the attempts by the West to trigger color revolutions in Xinjiang and Tibet, both fears that persist. After the meeting, Putin went back to Moscow, of course, and before the invasion of Ukraine, before launching the invasion of Ukraine, he withdrew his troops, which were deployed on the borders with China. Let's not forget that there are still outstanding problems between China and Russia, with China now having started a kind of cartographic aggression on the island in the river and also on Vladivostok. We again revived claims for both the Chinese. After that, Xi Jinping organized a Politburo meeting soon after Putin left, where he may have shared some of the details that he got from Putin, some of the briefing that he got from Putin with his colleagues. Because within about 4 to 5 days of that, we began seeing some modulation in the Chinese press of China's position on the entire issue. From an support, there was now an effort to try and modulate it so as they don't annoy the West too much and attract sanctions from there. An indication of how the Chinese are looking at it and what their real perspective is was given out a day ago by the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, which is a think tank of the Chinese Ministry of State Security, their foreign intelligence apparatus. And the researcher, quite unusually, in fact, made a fairly bold statement where he said that the US and the West are going to destroy themselves by applying sanctions and interfering in the problems in Ukraine. That's quite a bold statement for a researcher to make. Also, On the 25th of February, which is the day after Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, the Global Times, which is the paper owned by the Chinese Communist Party, came out with a very tough editorial warning Taiwan and threatening Taiwan. They said that do not be a pawn of the United States. You'll be ditched by the United States, and our army is ready to take care of you. So if you don't watch it, you will be in trouble. Finally, you have to come to the mainland China and unify with them. The level of threat has increased. There have been repeated and increased air flights over Taiwan. And recently, early in February, there was a so-called civilian Chinese aircraft which overflew an outlying island of Taiwan, almost as if to suggest that they could start an amphibious operation through some other means. This message seems to have been taken on by the Americans, and Biden today suddenly sent a delegation from five-member delegation from the United States to visit Taiwan. They're going to spend 30 hours there and then carry on to Japan. It's obviously a signal of deterrence, saying that America is going to be supportive of what Taiwan does. Having said all this, let me just say the stage is being set for the Russia and China to try and push, as they say, their vision of what a world order should be. And in doing so, they're challenging the United States and the West. Without taking any sides, I'd just say one thing, that the prospect of a China-Russia dominated world order, I don't think is something that many of us would be happy with. We'll be told how to think, what to eat, etc. That's not something that we are looking for. But that's not just our view. In China itself, there have been now some noises being made that Xi Jinping is following the wrong path. Some Chinese Communist Party officials have made statements suggesting that Xi Jinping is fighting the wrong battle, and there have been 5 academics who have also come out in the open and put up a post opposing the policy. And that's a very risky business in China because they're bound to be called up and penalized. I'll stop here. We'll hopefully go in for a second round. But over to Raghavan, Ambassador Raghavan, for your remarks. And I hope you can concentrate on the current situation as it develops. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaydev. Thanks, first of all, to the Vasant Vihar Club for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel. And congratulate you on your clairvoyance as well, as you said, of choosing this subject at this particular time. Though you couldn't have predicted that Russia would be sitting on the borders of Kiev at this point of time. But anyway, thank you very much. If I have to put the current situation, if you like, in brief, I would say that essentially this follows from a post-Cold War situation where you've had this progressive confrontation between Russia and NATO, which, to cut a long story short, came to a head in 2014 when a change of government in Ukraine caused Russia to stage manage a referendum in the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, and to take it over to annex it on the basis of a referendum that it organized. And that has unleashed a Cold War-like situation between Russia and the West, which stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea to the Caspian, and then also all the way along Russia's periphery to the Caucasus and West Asia to Afghanistan until recently as well. So this is a situation that has prevailed, in fact, since 2014, and we've all been victims of it because the West sanctions against Russia has also impacted on us in a big way, including CATSA, the secondary legislation which affected our defense cooperation with Russia. But a new page was attempted to be turned, and that is where this particular chapter begins, when President Biden met President Putin in Geneva in June last year. And that, in many ways, was against the run of play. I mean, in the middle of a Cold War, in the middle of various allegations which each side was throwing at each other. And Biden's justification of that meeting was that he needed to establish, he would like to establish a stable and predictable relationship with Russia so that they could cooperate in joining, in solving global issues. The subtext, of course, was that he wanted to sort of, in a way, not disengage, in a way, disengage, if you like, the US from various conflicts in Europe and in West Asia, to be able to focus more strongly on China as the principal strategic adversary that Biden himself identified. This, I would, and of course, other domestic issues that Biden wanted to concentrate on. I would say from all the reactions from that time onwards, President Putin welcomed this. You see, Russia, for all that, and I'll come to the Russia-China relationship and there's a close embrace, but for all the pivot to the East, Russia is fundamentally a European country, and that craving for acceptance in Europe is both emotional and strategic in Russia's makeup. So Putin actually welcomed this, Russia welcomed this, and there was a dialogue between Russia and the US, which actually extended right up to December, I would say, quite amicably. And basically, I would say what Putin's response to Biden was that, fine, let's look at a stable relationship, but in order to pursue this stable relationship, what I would like you to do is to address those concerns I have. The way Putin looks at it is that the NATO's confrontation all along Russia's periphery actually keeps Russia boxed in and restricts its sphere of influence. So he said, I can do a deal with you, if I can have a stable relationship, if you give me a security guarantee on my periphery. Now, what does the security guarantee involve? Essentially 2 points. One was that NATO weapon systems which are targeting Russia all along its periphery, and of course forcing Russia to go into a militarization drive and station its own missiles pointing at NATO. The American withdrawal from the ABM treaty and later from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty actually accentuated the threat. That is one. The second one was related to Ukraine and Georgia, which we often forget. But essentially, Ukraine, it's a very complex relationship with Russia. You can talk about its ethno-cultural links and Russia's great desire to fold Ukraine into an economic union. All that is fine. But there is a security aspect. The security aspect is that the Russia-Ukraine border is an extremely porous border. We've seen that in the present action as well. It has been the route to invasions into Russia from various Western, starting from the Poles in the 17th century onwards. Anyway, it's a porous border, but therefore you cannot afford to have, Russia cannot afford to have NATO stationed in Ukraine. The other one is the Crimean Peninsula. That is of strategic importance to Russia because of Sevastopol port being its only naval fleet in an all-weather port. That's the only, Russia's only all-weather port in spite of its huge coastline. And however, I mean, in spite of the fact that it's a very tortuous progression to the Mediterranean Sea through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. But Russia, if it wants to be a great power again, it felt it needed this naval fleet in order to project maritime power, without which, of course, it cannot be a great power. And that is the reason why it took over Crimea in 2014. And that's also the reason why it cannot countenance NATO being in Ukraine. Now, the deal with Biden was that we come to an agreement on mutual security guarantees on our periphery, and you guarantee to me in some form or the other that NATO will not advance to Ukraine. I mean, all the other, there was a whole lot of rhetoric there and all kinds of legal guarantees were sought, etc., etc. But the bottom line was you need to find some method of guaranteeing that NATO will not be in Ukraine and the militarization, NATO militarization of Ukraine will not take place. It seemed that these negotiations were going on fairly well. At some point of time, Putin came to the conclusion, and Putin came to the conclusion that the Americans and the Europeans were not united on exactly how to achieve this. he mounted troops on the border of Ukraine in order to apply pressure. And then apparently he thought that this was not doing it, and therefore he invaded. Now one can, of course, question his judgment, many people have questioned the soundness of his mind as well in doing this, whatever it is. I mean, but essentially that is the background to his walking into Ukraine. And of course, quite obviously, he's facing far greater opposition than he thought he would face. All that is there. But eventually, I mean, they will overwhelm Ukraine, particularly since NATO is very clear in its mind it will not engage Russian troops. NATO will send arms and ammunition and economic aid to Ukraine, but will not engage Russian troops. And even sending advanced arms to Ukraine, it may be a bit too late at this stage, because Russians seem to be in a position to block the deployment of arms, even if they let them in. The other hand, what has the West done? Showing unprecedented unity, the West has actually unveiled sanctions beyond anything that they've unleashed on anybody in the world. I mean, this variety of sanctions have not been unleashed on any country other than Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. And they've cut Russia off the central bank off from much of its reserves. They have actually cut many of the Russian banks off SWIFT system. They have imposed all kinds of sanctions, and they have applied pressure in various other ways as well. You know, all the oil majors investing in Russia have announced that they will withdraw from there. Shell Oil, BP, ExxonMobil, and there's a huge variety of foreign companies, including our Tata Motors, Jaguar Land Rover, all of which have said that they will stop business with Russia. So there is a very, very powerful sanctions machinery and political pressure that has been unleashed. Now, I would argue that, yes, Putin is in a fair amount of trouble and is now under pressure to both finish his Ukraine campaign quickly and to deal with the consequences of this the financial nuclear attack that has been launched on Russia, and to see how he can manage the economy. But by doing this kind of an attack, I would suggest that the West also has placed itself in some kind of pressure, because this kind of pain you inflict on Russia will not be without pain for the Western economies as well. And you can see that. I mean, you can already see the spike in the commodity prices now, and you can see, Biden saying yesterday that he had, along with 30 countries, they've arranged for 60 million barrels of oil to be released from strategic reserves. Now, that's about 60% of one day's consumption of oil in the world. So what are we talking about? You see the problems that are there. And therefore, the longer this standoff lasts, the more Putin will definitely be under pressure. But also, the more the West will be pushed to reach some accommodation. So this is what we are seeing now, what I think is a window of opportunity for some kind of a deal to arrange. Now, whether that deal will look at just a band-aid to get over the current tensions, or whether that will deal with the larger issue, which is really that of a security architecture in Europe. You know, whatever Russia is and whatever rogue actor you talk about, you say Russia is, it is a large force in Europe, and somehow you need a settlement that takes care of Russia's security along with the security of these countries, the Baltic countries and the other former Soviet Union countries, which deserve. So this is what we are looking at. We're looking at hopefully some kind of a settlement which can arrive in the near future. Only one point more about India's position. Now, a lot of things have been said about India having been neutral and India not taking a stand, and that you have to take a stand today. Now, look, geopolitics is a long game. What is happening today will not be tomorrow. So by supporting one and condemning another today, you do not achieve anything for the tomorrow. So I think we need to look at our interests. There are reasons why we need our geopolitical interests require our connections with all these countries that are involved today. And we need to see how we protect those interests rather than grandstand. That's basically it now about Russia, China. I have my views about that, but since I've completed my time, maybe we can talk about it at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghavan. Yeah, so the new world order is shaping up. Let's see what happens. Can I request Professor Raja Mohan to make his remarks? And again, Raja, maybe 7-8 minutes, and then we'll request Dr. Baru.
And thank you, General, for organizing this. Let me join Ambassador Raghavan in congratulating on the topic. But I would just add one thing. The alignments seem fairly robust for India. Alignments among the major powers is fairly robust, I think, both between China and Russia, as well as what's happened in the last few days in Europe. So in some ways, in politics, we say that about domestic politics, but what we've seen happen in the last 1 month, not even 1 month, from February 4th, when Xi Jinping met Putin in Beijing of Ukraine in the last few days, has profoundly changed the equations. I mean, we were talking about how Russia and China come together. This is going to be an earth-shaking event amidst the disarray, disunity among the Western countries. But what we've seen happen 3 weeks later is the demonstration of unprecedented unity by the Western countries. NATO is strong, has become strong. The EU, which is a geopolitical dwarf, is talking about a larger military role. And Germany, which is historically post-war renounced armaments, today is talking about rearmament of Germany. And that too by a democratic leader, a social democrats, who have been very close to Russia historically, who today talk about 100 billion euros this year's budget and 2% of the GDP economy, around $4.5 billion. So they're going to spend 2% of their annual budget on defense. So this is a historically big moment in Europe. And then we've heard the Japanese Prime Minister, former Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, talk about that what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. As Ranade said, it has implications for Taiwan. So Abe-san was not only calling for greater clarity on the American side, that they will defend Taiwan, but he was also saying something interesting. He was saying, time has come for Japan to debate whether it should host American nuclear weapons on its soil. He said, no, it's not going to happen. But this is really a dog whistle for Japan's own nuclear option. Debate in Japan for a long time. And South Korea, a similar debate is going on, and you'll see some of it in the elections. And we've seen AUKUS happen, which is not nuclear weapons, but nuclear propulsion that's taking place in Australia. What we're beginning to see is the Russian expansionism. I'm not going to mince any words here. The Chinese and Russian expansionism, territorial expansionism, the neighbors, that this is no longer a business as usual, and that drastic remedies are needed to deal with the power of each of them and the capacity to upturn the existing order. So that's where the Japanese rearmament, German rearmament or the Japanese debate on nuclear weapons, we are into a profoundly different set of debates. And this has nothing to do with NPT, all that nonsense we've gone through, but I think we're going to see big changes in the way the great power relations go. The second, I think, aspect I would want to really look at is, I think in international politics, jo jeeta hai wahi Sikandar. The idea you can say, look, you're a good guy, you had historic grievances, you were misled, you were taken for a ride. All that doesn't really matter. If you either you win, if you choose to go for war, either you win or get a draw, or if you lose, the consequences are going to be severe. Countries which make mistakes.
Professor Rajamohan, may I interrupt? Your voice is fading at times, so maybe you need to stay closer to the mic at all times.
International relations, is it any better?
Yes, please.
It's not about morality. It's not about whataboutery. If you say Russian invasion, talk about American invasions, or this is about double standards. Double standards is part of life in international politics. So therefore, the question is, who will get away with use of force? Ukraine today is, can Russia get away with the use of force unleashed in Europe? Get rid of this.
Raja, when you go back a little bit, that's what creates a problem.
No, I think. Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yeah.
Is it better now?
We'll give you a minute.
Yeah, but it keeps fading away from time to time.
So I think he has removed his earphones now. Those were creating.
Yeah, I did. Hopefully this will work better. No, I was saying in international politics, use of force is a risky business. That if you make a mistake by unleashing war and you can't get away with what you try to do, the costs of that, not only for the nation that's unleashed it, because war, as we know, those of us who study international relations, war is one of the principal agents of change in international order, as well as in the domestic politics of countries. So when you undertake a big risky venture, that has consequences, both I think for Russia's internal organization, as well as the European order, and its impact on Asia will be felt. So that is the thing here. We have to be realistic. This is not deciding who's right, who's wrong, who had a grievance historically, whether they were good guys or bad guys. But what they're going to do and what this war does will have an effect on everyone in Europe and Asia. Second, I think I just want to say a word about Putin's NATO narrative. I mean, I think it's interesting to compare Putin's narrative with what China has done in the last 40 years, which is China has had American troops on its front yard in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, for 70 years. So China's approach in dealing with that fundamental challenge to its security was to win over the United States, create a set of integration, and now consolidate yourself and push back. But the Russian strategy, I think, essentially, I believe it's because it's a declining power. Its focus was on its past glory as a nuclear weapon power, using its military resources to force a revision of the order. But my sense is, with $1.6 trillion of GDP, which is half of India's GDP at this time, if you think you can fundamentally change the order, vis-a-vis European Union, that is $16 trillion, and the US, of course, is much bigger, this, I think, is a gamble that you can think that you can use leverage nuclear weapons and the threat to escalate that to seek a revision in the international order. In the old days, Marxists used to say the correlation of forces is not in Russia's favor. He will win some tactical victories because he has overwhelming force on the ground. But over the longer term, that his ability to deal with the combined forces of the West and Japan will be quite hard. So I think that's the second set of issues. The third set of issues, okay, and I'm coming to the last one. I think for India, the big problem is this, that the shift in the great power politics has put us in a situation where China can ramp up military pressure on India any day it wants, sitting on our territory, and in a eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with India in a large number of sectors. And then we have to go to the Russians to be able to have any kind of fight against China. And then China and Russia are on the same side. They're closer than ever before. Therefore, the challenge of dealing with the Sino-Russian partnership and the debate that we need to separate ourselves from the US at this point sounds to me quite something that the emphasis on strategic autonomy, when you have actually two powers which have combined capacity to undermine at any time they want. And they're also roping in Pakistan into this. So this is a fundamentally challenging situation for India. And that's where the uneasiness for India comes in. The Sino-Russian partnership puts us in extraordinary bind we've not been in for the last 70 years.
Thanks, Rajan. I'll go over to Dr. Sanjay Baru now, and hopefully we'll be able to come back, if he sticks to his 7 to 8 minutes, come back for a quick round for final points from all of us within 1 to 2 minutes. Sanjay, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ranade, and thank you to the Vasant Vihar Club. I'm delighted to be at this discussion a second time, though last time it was physical, but I'm happy it's not physical this time because I'm in Hyderabad and not in Delhi. You had originally asked me to speak on kind of looking at the economic situation in India and challenges we are facing, but I think given what has happened and the focus of the discussion, I will not get into too much of the economics. And since General Shankar Chaudhary asked me to speak on the narrative, on the media, etc., maybe I will say a little more on that. The first point I'd like to make is that it's a difficult world we live in, and it's not the first time we are living in it. The question for us really, and this is something is a view I've taken for a long time, is what should our priority be? I consistently have argued that our priority has to be internal. Unfortunately, we are an English-speaking country, constantly exposed to the international debates and discussions in the English language. And most of us, particularly those who are living in Vasant Vihar, we are all globalized in our own ways. And so we imagine ourselves to be part of the world in a manner in which we are not. We are still essentially an economy driven by domestic forces, by a domestic engine. Our share of world trade is still around 1.5% in merchandise. If we add services, about 3%. We are an insignificant global player. Our ability to influence the course of events as they are unfolding, in my judgment, is marginal. Now, we can pretend to be a big player because we are at the moment in the UN Security Council and our voice is heard. But I do think that the current challenge is something we need to once again focus at home on our economic capacity and capability, particularly because in the recent past, in the last 5-6 years, we have actually economically become weaker. Our capacity to sustain a higher defense budget has gone down. Our capacity to sustain exports has gone down. Our share of world exports actually gone down in the last 5 years. Our capacity to generate adequate surplus to finance public investment has gone down. Fiscal deficits have gone up. Given our incapacity, I think we should not have an exaggerated view ourselves. And there is nothing wrong at all if India at the moment says, let these big fellows play their games. Let us pursue a strategy which takes care of our interests, including our problems on the border with China, whatever those problems are with Pakistan. We need a new ways of looking at these issues. Unfortunately, in our discussion at home, I'm not a geopolitical analyst. I'm not a international relations scholar, but I don't think we have approached the China problem in the correct perspective. Dr. Manmohan Singh tried to approach the Pakistan problem in a perspective that has now been abandoned. But we need to change our perspective in dealing with our neighbors so that we are then able to devote more focus on our domestic capacity capability building. This is what China did from the 1980s through the 90s. And that is what we actually need to do right now. I will not worry too much about whether Russia comes out of this well or badly, or America comes out of it more powerful, or China comes out of it more powerful. My worry is that we do not have the capacity to come out of it more powerful. In other words, our capacities are limited. And actually our capacities today are less than our capacities were 10 years back. I don't have the time to elaborate on that, but I can defend that argument. The second point I'd make, and this is in response to what I've been asked to speak on the narrative, a lot of the narrative, in fact, does not focus on this. A lot of the narrative is being influenced by essentially Western perceptions, because now we are being told, the racist language is being used against us. I mean, even a very, very intelligent and respected journalist like Edward Luce, who was a FT correspondent in India, married to an Indian, someone a good friend of mine, has been tweeting in the last few days, virtually abusing India. The Western media is full of abuse of India. Racist language is being used. This narrative, and as a consequence, our own media is internalizing a lot of this argument. That today the West is, the good guys, Putin is a bad guy, and we should not support the bad guy, and we should in fact be supporting the good guy. I mean, this narrative which has been building across television channels, across social media, across a large part of the English media. I don't look at Hindi, etc. But I think this narrative doesn't serve us well. And this is where I think the government has to step in and offer a narrative. I have not found a narrative being offered by the government so far. Neither the Prime Minister, nor the Foreign Minister, nor the National Security Advisor have spoken. Maybe this is not the time for them to speak. Maybe they focus on our management of crisis. But I think we need to hear our government speaking on what is our understanding of what is happening. Just explaining an abstention vote is not adequate. What is the global narrative and what exactly are our priorities? I actually think the time has come in. I heard today a tweet the Prime Minister said in Uttar Pradesh that India is able to bring back Indians from Ukraine because we are a rising power. I mean, it's all right in an election rally to say these things, but it doesn't make any sense. The fact is that our ability to influence global events is limited, and therefore our narrative has to be able to defend our inabilities rather than claim excessive ability, because then there is a gap between what people expect us to do, not just in India, internationally. A lot of the disappointment with India and India's vote arises from the fact that people imagined India was going to do much more for the world. We called ourselves a rising power, leading power, all kinds of adjectives were used. And therefore the world is now saying, oh, what are you? You are just another third world country. Well, we are a third world country. Merely because now we have more billionaires than we had 10 years back doesn't make us even a second world country. We are a third world country. We are a low income developing country. We are a country with still 20 to 30% of our population in poverty. I have to constantly remind the Indian elite of these basic hard facts of our incapacities in order to justify my argument that we need to lower our sights. And as if we continue to pretend that going one way or another is going to help us, I'm afraid that is not the way to go forward. Merely because there's a threat from China and Russia, if we today become, ally ourselves with the West, I don't see the West addressing any of our concerns. Are they addressing our concerns in WTO? No. Are they addressing our concerns on climate change? No. Are they addressing our concerns on migration of talent? No. What are our Indian economic concerns? Market access, investment in areas where we need. None of our major concerns are being addressed within a government-to-government framework. They are being addressed within a market-to-market framework, which will continue to happen as long as we are part of the global economy. Let me stop with that.
Thank you, Sanjay. I think we've had a fairly good first round where we've got insights into what's happening. And I think a final round, we can still have maybe a minute each or a minute and a half each. I find that General Shankar Prasad is nodding. That means we got a little bit of a green light, but he can always intercede and stop us again. But let's take 1.5 minutes. In that, I'll just make a couple of points, looking at listening to what all has been said. The first thing is that I think for us, the level of threat, to my mind, has increased. It is increased after what Putin did, not because of Russia, but because of China. As I said, Xi Jinping and Putin are cast in the same mold, more or less. And Xi Jinping is also a risk taker, a man who's plotted his moves very carefully and who goes for broke. And the way he's looking at things now, he's looking at the United States very intently. If he senses any weakness in US or West's reaction towards Russia, then I suspect that he will start implementing what I call the part 2 of his program for us. What he did initially in April 2020, May 2020, was initiate a military operation. We were able to counter build up quite quickly, and we stopped him. But that's not the end of it. That is, it's a holding operation. He's stretched us because he's spread the threat level right across the line of actual control. But I suspect that he will do something else wherever, either cut off our access to the north, DBO Depsang Plains, or try something in the Northeast. The second thing, and I'm not getting into Taiwan, I touched on it. The second is to balance our own needs for capital, huge capital, for technology, etc. Where can we get it from? We can get it from the West, and yet we are caught in a situation where we need things from Russia, and of course, to a limited extent, unfortunately, from China and the West. So how do we balance that? It's subject best left to economists and strategic planners. We can't discuss it here, but these are 2 points that I'd like to put out. But finally, just that our threat level has gone up in my estimation. Over to you, Raghavan. Just a minute and a half.
Thank you. Agree with you that our threat level has gone up considerably. There's no doubt about that. But coming back to where we are on this reordering of the world order, whether the world order is being reordered or not, I think is still a question mark. I think we need to see how all of this, both in Europe and to our east, develops. Raja mentioned both in different contexts. But to take Russia first, essentially what Raja said was right. Russia is, if you want to take John McCain, a gas station masquerading as a nation. If you want to talk about what an independent correspondent said, it is upper volta with nuclear weapons. Yes, both of them are actually correct in their own way. And in addition to that, it is also the natural resources capital of the world. It's got all kinds of raw materials and natural resources that the entire world depends on. So the question now is, all this while the West did not bring Russia down to its knees, not because it couldn't, but because of this factor of dependence on its raw materials and commodities for its economic well-being. Now, today, when you have these harrowing stories, and I think you mentioned, I think Dr. Baru mentioned this racism, the reason why an invasion into Ukraine aroused so much emotion as an invasion into Iraq did not. I mean, I'm not comparing the two, but the point is simply that these are white guys, and these are like us. As somebody said, they watch Netflix and they are on Instagram, and they're Christian. So that is the reason why this outpouring of emotion is there. But tomorrow, when it goes off the TV screens, will the West be as united as it is today? Will it continue to see Russia as an existential threat? Because eventually, strategic considerations come well below immediate political considerations. You have to win an election tomorrow. Your strategic calculations will only take effect 20 years later. So today, you keep up the pressure on Putin, however badly the war goes, and however much you want to rub his nose into the ground. If you can do it, very great. But can you do it? Until that time, will you keep inflicting pressure on yourself? That's my point. My point is that, will the West remain united after this thing goes off our TV screens? Because their economies are not yet geared to take that pain. So that will itself retard a rapid reordering of the world order. And therefore, till then, we have to see what we can do. And the other point that Raja mentioned, absolutely right. You have a Sino-Russian collaboration. Jaidev, you mentioned it as well. But the point also is that when China is in Ladakh, we do go running to the Russians. Do we have an alternative? Do we know how to go running to anybody else? I mean, so until such time as we have to go rushing to the Russians, we have to find some way of dealing with them. And that's a simple point. The Americans today are not in a position to give you the arms at the speed at which you want them in order to keep your military preparedness at the level as you need it to be. So this is a major dilemma that we have. So if we didn't have that dilemma, then you could talk really about an alignment one way or the other. You cannot afford that. And the geography is there as well. I mean, you've got right above you, you've got both Russia and China. America is some distance away. I mean, rich uncle in far away has his limitations in helping you entirely. So hey, this is the challenge that we have. I'm not otherwise contesting any of the points that all of you made.
Quite right. You've also raised the specter of Ukraine becoming, in course of time, the Afghanistan of Europe. You never know. I mean, if the others don't bother about it. Rajamohan, last, a minute and a half before I go to Dr. Baru.
Sorry, I took more time last time because of all the mess, but let me make 3 quick propositions. One, Putin is a major loser from this conflict. Russia has negative leverage, its nuclear weapons, its military, and its natural resources, as Ambassador Raghavan said. Russia can come back as a diminished power. It is already a diminished power. That it can still has enough leverage, a negative leverage to reorder something. But under Putin, an accommodation, which seemed possible 2 weeks ago, is going to be very, very hard. It can be tactical accommodation, but it won't be much. But Russia in the long term will remain an important place. Second, China is a potential winner in this. Well, there are complications tactically for China. China today is stronger vis-a-vis Russia, which is likely to become even a bigger junior partner. At the same time, the Chinese say, you want to fight the Americans? Be my guest. I'll talk to Goldman Sachs. You go, good Slav, stand up and poke the West in the eye. That takes a mind off me. But I'm going to do business with them. I got a massive agenda with the West. So China is going to be stronger vis-a-vis Russia, has opening vis-a-vis America, and its upper hand over India will get even stronger. So therefore, that is the reality we have to deal with. Third, for India, I think for India, the problem is to get out of the logjam we are in is whether you can produce a better defense industry at home that can produce weapons. Your principal dependence on Russia is on the weapon side. Trade is nothing, really, $8 billion this year compared to $160 billion with the US. So it is really the weapons side where, in the name of keeping Russia happy, we've created a structure. I mean, it's right or wrong, there's no point going back. But at this point, the Prime Minister is talking about more defense production at home. I don't know how many of you have seen his speech on Friday where he said, producing weapons at home is a patriotic duty. Now, the question is, it can't be done overnight. So is there a strategy to break the dependence on Russia? Not today, not tomorrow, but in 4 years, 5 years. I think that should be the principal challenge for us. How we do that is the great thing. And after that, I would just add one last thing. The nature of the Indian economy has fundamentally changed. That today, our relationship, commercial, people to people, is much stronger with the West. That is, you put Europe and America together, the scale of our engagement with them. Well, Russia is diminished within our larger calculus, borrowing weapons. That's a new reality. My sense is, to quote J.N. Dixit, the former foreign secretary in the early 90s, he used to talk about Bharatanatyam, Indian diplomacy doing Bharatanatyam, when you're caught in a difficult situation on Kashmir on nuclear weapons. So our Bharatanatyam in the next few days will be find a way to not to be seen as too close to Russia, but to create openings so that we don't get too isolated.
Thank you, Raja. Dr. Baru, final comments, 1.5 minutes or so. You're muted.
2 quick comments. First and foremost, I agree with what was said that it may be premature to conclude that the global kind of balance of power has fundamentally shifted in favor of China or Russia, or that the West is going to remain united. These are all things I'm not an expert, and I don't know whether, in what way these relationships will move. But having said that, I do think that we need to look more closely at the relationship with countries that are concerned both with China's power as well as American power or American priorities, which is countries in Europe, France and Germany, countries in Asia, Japan, Vietnam. There are a large number of countries which are actually in the same situation in which we are, which is that they have concern about China, but they are not very sure about their dependence on America. And that is the world in which we are. I don't know, our dependence on the West has increased, but whether that is a strength or vulnerability, I'm not very clear. Merely to say that our dependence on the West has increased and to imagine that's a strength, I don't think this is adequate. So given all these problems, I do think, final point I would make, is that this is an opportunity to think afresh. A lot of what I have been reading in the media in the last 10 days, in the Indian media, is really premised on structures that we have lived with in the last 10, 20 years. But I was rethinking, Raja mentioned J.N. Dixit, 1998, after the nuclear tests, when the National Security Advisory Board was set up under Mr. Subramaniam's leadership, when that group met, and both Raja and I were members of that group, when we met in that group, the atmosphere was one of the need to think afresh, that there's a new world, a new context. India is now a nuclear power, and that we need to think afresh about our relationship with the world. I do believe that we are today in that situation where we need to think afresh, and merely going by past, the momentum of past relationships, whether it is with a declining power like Russia or a rising power with like China or the existing powers like the West. I think the momentum of the past is not an adequate guide to the kind of positions we need to take as we move along. And therefore, new thinking, creative thinking about where we are, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what should be our priorities, how do we deal with this new threat? You talked about a rising threat. There are ways in which we can deal with this threat which are non-military. That is why I do think there are new ways in which we need to look at Pakistan and China, at our entire neighborhood. Do we have the political courage? Do we have the political leadership to have that imagination? If we have, then we don't have to feel that desperate about the current situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjay. Thank you very much. General Shankar Prasad, over to you. I think this is a good note on which to wind up the panel. At least, fresh thinking is required. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jayant, and all of my very privileged panelists. You see, what happens then when we have a discussion of this nature with people who are so knowledgeable, with people who can think in many directions, time is a major factor. And I think the secret of success lies that if you can stick to time, you are doing a great job. Because otherwise, this discussion is so interesting, and there are so many facets to it that you could go on for hours and still not be getting bored. But nevertheless, I will take all the questions together, because then it will be difficult to take each question separately and answering separately. There are a few issues that some of the people who are on the chat have written down, but I will summarize them all into one or two major questions. And I think the concerned people who are more devoted towards it can respond to them. The first issue is that there has been, in the current issue, as far as the Russia and Ukraine issue is concerned, there seems to be a very major error in strategic understanding. Great errors have been made in really understanding the strategic difficulties that each one has got. And I think I'd like to say strategic miscalculations, if I may say. So there will be a little response to the word military miscalculations by the strategic powers. The second, I want to really raise a question which some of the panelists would also raise. How long is India going to remain neutral? And I'm sorry, the current questions are relating more to the immediate situation, which is showing us in Russia and Ukraine. Therefore, everybody is keen to know more on that. And the question that arises is, which also appeared in the media today, as to how long India is going to remain neutral, and then how is this neutrality going to carry on? And of course, the most important thing that I'd like to bring in is that, and Sanjay Baru may like to respond to it, you see, everything that we are seeing today, whether it is related to the current conflict situation or whether it's related to any other issues that are happening to us, we are completely motivated and completely informed only by the media. Now, if you see the TV channels today, particularly in the Ukraine and Russia conflict, you see the whole thing so differently. I mean, how can you ever make an assessment of what is going on in that so-called battlefield when the images you see are in various forms projected to you, and there are bombs going, there are some, people saying helicopters flying. I mean, the journalists are making people really realize as if the world is coming to an end. So, Sanjay, I would like you to please advise us as to how to look at media, because the only source of information that we have is the media, whether it's television or whether it's the newspaper. And the media seems to be fairly, if I may use the word with your permission, a bit motivated. So the motivated media is creating a tremendous amount of assessments which we make, which could be completely out of context. And a specific question about which is being raised, and I think we need to deliberate on that, and we also spoken about it during the conversation. that with the kind of economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia now, how will it affect arms availability to India from Russia? Will they be able to continue doing that, or will there be a break in that? And how exactly are we going to look at the Russian equipment which we so desperately need is coming? And finally, just last word before I give it back to the panelist, that yes, everybody seems to be very clear about the fact that India needs to indigenize its military capabilities of developing equipments. And as we all know, 68% of the stuff has to be procured or manufactured within the country. But then it takes a long time to develop military hardware. And so the concept is right, the thinking is right, but its implication and it's really, fructifying it in the real form is difficult. And of course, we have serious security threats on our borders, and it could flash any time. I mean, the summers are coming, the Chinese are sitting there. There is a lot happening in Pakistan, China, collusion, so all of that. So these are the few questions that are up there. And of course, there is need to develop self-interest. Is the world getting again leading to a bipolar world? And the last question that comes up is, and I'm putting all of them together so that we can answer them in one go to save time. How does this business of nuke coming up? I mean, people saying, I put my nuclear arsenal in readiness, and there's some television showed some American pictures to say the Americans have also got their nukes ready or getting ready. And the Russians saying that we want some of the neighboring countries to remove the nukes from there. So are these nukes no longer the weapons of deterrence, or are they so soon going to be weapons of use? So these are the few questions that have arisen. There are many more that can come up, but we're trying to remain within the time. We've already overshot a little bit. A quick responses to maybe Sanjay Baru can reply first, because media is something that we really want to know. How to handle this motivated media and giving us all kinds of pictures and details of it.
So very quickly, two answers to your question. First of all, I used to give a lecture at the National Defense College. Since you are from the armed forces, let me tell you, I have given lectures at the National Defense College.
Perhaps I have attended some of them.
On media management and national security. And so I have actually a template and PowerPoint presentations on that. But having said that, let me add that when I earlier referred to the government, what is the Indian government's position? How does the government see what is happening? From Prime Minister to Foreign Minister to NSA. What are they doing about the media? My job when I was with the Prime Minister's office was precisely this, to be able to advise the functionaries to how to deal with the media in a crisis situation. Or, so therefore I assume that this government has individuals who are charged with this responsibility. Now, if you are so worried about what the media is doing, then the question really is, what is the government doing about it? What kind of communication are they putting out? What is it that they would like the Indian viewer to watch? That's point number one. Point number two, this government has proved very competent in manipulating the media when it comes to its own political interests. And large parts of the media have been made pro-government, and those who are not supporters of the government have been punished in severe ways, including arrest. So the government has a capacity. But at the same time, we see enormous Western influence on our media. And I mean, I go back, like Raja Mohan, we all go back to the 1960s and 70s. In our young youth, we talked about the KGB and the CIA and which newspaper editor or which magazine was funded by the CIA, who was funded by the KGB. We have lived through all those years. And I cannot imagine today that they're not all active. Whether it's the CIA or the KGB or the Chinese or the Israelis or the Pakistanis, I'm sure Mr. Ranade will tell us they're all active. Now,
So
who is being influenced by whom?
Media is motivated.
No, media is not individually motivated. It's not that these chaps who are appearing, because I don't watch television, I don't even have television at home, and I've not had it for the last several years. But my point is, these individuals, whether it's a Arnab or a Rajdeep or whoever it is, they're not individually motivated. They have been influenced.
Yeah.
And the question is, who is influencing them? Is the government putting out information? Has there been adequate background briefing? I don't know. I mean, these are the questions to be asked.
Thank you.
This has to be done. There has to be deep background briefing. There has to be regular background briefing. There has to be overground briefing. So unless those things are there, you will be frustrated sitting at home watching the media and wondering, why the hell am I watching this?
Thank you so much. But we still remain, we have to make up our own mind what to believe and what not to believe. Raja, would you like to say something about what the nuclear weapons are doing?
Yeah.
And, major powers talking about them and saying we're getting ready with them.
Yes, sir. Before that, I mean, it's about the media. What I do is I don't watch Indian news channels. They're really entertainment channels. So if you want entertainment, you watch them. But there are other ways of getting news these days. I mean, you don't have to watch TV to get news. I mean, there are other TV channels. In Europe, the coverage of the war has been fairly extensive. And on internet, you can get a fantastic coverage. A lot of it is visual. You can watch it on your computer. So I would say there are other sources of news. But then even there, the truth is the first casualty in a war. So don't expect everyone will be loaded with some ideas. But I think there are alternative ways of understanding what is going on rather than the entertainment channels that we produce. I would say watch the business channel, CNBC 18. Because they're dealing with the stock market. They're talking with trade. So that is far more real. I mean, if you want credible news, they deal with reality far more. On the nuclear weapons, I see actually the value of nuclear weapons going up. Some in Ukraine feel if they did not have given up the nuclear weapons in 91, Russia wouldn't have done this. Russia is saying, look, I got thousands of nuclear weapons. I can keep escalating this. If you don't give me a deal, I continue the war, what choices do you have? Either accept what I'm doing or escalate. So I think Putin is demonstrating that. And Putin has also said American nuclear weapons should be removed from Europe. That is, only my nuclear weapons will remain in Europe. That will probably add to his future strength, but that's not going to be accepted. In fact, I would suspect nuclear sharing arrangements between the US and its NATO partners is going to go up, which is what Abe-san wants in the East, of greater nuclear sharing arrangements between US and Japan, which we're going to see a lot more of that. I think AUKUS is really merely a precursor of that. Meanwhile, Putin also wants to deploy Russian nuclear weapons on Belarus, which is also is almost under their control today. So you'll see a lot more value for nuclear, both as an instrument of blackmail, as well as an instrument of deterrence. That is, if Japan has nuclear weapons, China is not going to do what it has done to Ukraine, though it has even a bigger quarrels with Japan than Russia has with Ukraine. So I would say nuclear weapons are back and back with a vengeance.
Thank you so much, Raja. And there are 3 points.
I'd just like to add a quick one, which is that in the Russian military playbook, the nuclear weapon is actually something that is deployable in conventional war, which is not there in the Western or I think
Chinese, or even Chinese.
Yeah.
Ambassador Raghavan, just 2-3 points if you could tell us, as we mentioned in the questions, strategic miscalculations, the possibility of Russian arms delivery to us getting delayed, and the neutrality of India and various world forums. Just very briefly, if you can speak about these issues.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, strategic miscalculation. I think what has happened right now are a series of tactical miscalculations rather than strategic miscalculations. I think Putin badly miscalculated the impact of what he's doing in Ukraine, and to a certain extent, the US and NATO also miscalculated the extent to which Putin would go to push what he wanted to do. So I think without these miscalculations, this crisis could have been pushed further down the line, let's put it that way. I think that's what we are seeing now, the result of a couple of tactical miscalculations. Now, as far as India remaining neutral goes, well, what India has done is not condemned the Russian invasion, but that's about it. It talked about territorial integrity and sovereignty and so on. The reason actually is the arms which Jan Shankar Prasad, which you said as well. Now, Raja mentioned our indigenization of our arms industry. I can tell you that in the last 2.5 years of my term in the NSAB, we were working very strongly on this question of how do you indigenize capacity, defense capacity. And it's extraordinarily difficult. And General Shankar Prasad, you would know very well, and you would agree with me. The problem is many. There are problems of technology. There are problems of finances. There are problems of structure. And on top of everything else, there's a problem of mindset, which prevents us from making the kind of progress. And, getting a vibrant defense industry that can separate you from Russia to a certain extent, to a full extent you can't, but anyway, to a large extent, is not going to take 3 or 4 years. It will probably take 20 years.
Yes, absolutely.
That is the big problem. And therefore, for 20 years, you are moving in that direction. And therefore, for 20 years, you've got to be careful. I mean, we're not as big a power as we think we are. And that's a big issue. And you see, the Americans can only step into a certain extent into this breach because you have already an infrastructure that exists. If you have to junk everything and buy, it's not soap or shampoo. So this is where the big problem is. You're tied in various ways. You're very worried about Sino-Russian alliance, if you like. But where do you have to go? So this is the ultimate problem with Russia, and that is what it takes you into a position which makes you, squirm to explain your position. And the last point about public communications, I think, you see, our security establishment, this is the other thing that in the NSAB we work very hard to see whether we can do something about. Our security establishment is hopeless at public communications. It just doesn't do it. Other wings of government do what they're doing for whatever reason, but our security establishment, I can tell you that when they appointed the NSAB, the note appointing the NSAB was marked secret. and therefore, I can tell you to this day, the NSAB, which I headed for 4 years, there is no public statement of its existence.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. And 30 seconds to each speaker. Where do you see this war ending in Ukraine and Russia? 30 seconds to each one. Sanjay, you're on mute.
I'm sorry.
All my participants are keen to know how quickly is it happening and what will be the outcome. Very quick, 30 seconds.
Sir, though my mother named me Sanjaya, my Sanjaya Vacha is not adequate to answer your question. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
You will pass that question. Raja, when will it end and how soon it will end and what will be the final verdict? You're mute, sir. You're muted.
No, I'm saying there are solutions on offer. Give a part of Ukraine to Russia, ensure the sovereignty of Ukraine, make it neutral vis-a-vis Russia. So there are pathways, but at this point, my sense is in the next few weeks, Russia is not going to get all it wants in this war. The Americans are not going to be able to push the Russians out of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have problems of their own. So there have to be a negotiation. And I think, let's see that there's somewhere when this comes to a stalemate, because Russians will announce a regime there, a regime change. They'll bring someone to say he's the anti-fascist leader of Ukraine, but the insurgency will start. But at some point, when peace breaks out, only when there is a stalemate, a military stalemate, and I think the stalemate might not be too far.
Ambassador Raghavan, when do you see Russian forces withdrawing out from Ukraine after doing their mission?
I don't think the Russians will, as Raja said, I don't think the Russians can complete a mission that they set out to accomplish. But they can, like others have done before them, always claim mission has been accomplished at some point of time in whatever.
Declare victory and get out.
Question to Rana Day. Tell us, where do you think, I mean, just we're summing it up. That's the last one that you're going to get to say, where is it all ending, the current impasse that we are in?
I think the Americans are going to drive a hard bargain. They're going to make things difficult for Russia, as they have with these sanctions. The Russians are not going to let things go. I think we are going to see some signal heavy pounding of Ukraine, after which there will be talks and Russia and America will reach a settlement. That's how I look at it. It'll take a few weeks.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. And last word, international relations in uneasy alignment was the subject. And that's exactly what we have discussed today. And I don't know how brilliantly this was coined to be the heading of our discussion today, international relations in uneasy alignments. Thank you very much, Jaidev,
I think
Raja,
we've had
Sanjay.
an absolutely riveting discussion this evening on this very important topic, and I must thank each one of the panelists for coming out with their gems. And thank you so much, Jan Shankar Prasad, for adding your part to this. Uh, Before we wind up, I just want to remind people of the forthcoming next two sessions. On Friday, we are talking about the exciting world of cricket. And on Saturday, we remember the Nightingale of India, Lata Mangeshkar, who recently passed away. So please do tune in into those two sessions also. And we will keep you updated with the rest of the program as we go along. We have the whole of March full of events under the Springfest 2022. Thank you so much, all of you,
Thank you, sir.
and
Thank you very
good
much.
night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.